While quartz watches in general are considerably less expensive compared to their mechanical counterparts, the disparity in cost even is more pronounced when you're talking about complications like a chronograph. In this video, we're going to be looking at two watches under $1,000, chronographs specifically, that I think are leaders in this price arena. One with the Bulova Lunar Pilot, and then the Seiko Speedtimer. So how this is going to work, we have 11 different categories or points of criteria that we are going to go through. Each one of those categories represents 1 point. So if a watch gets the win in that category, it will get 1 point. If we're unable to decide on a winner, we will then give a point to both of the watches. And at the end, we'll tally up all the points and see who comes out on top. Also, after watching this, if you want even more in-depth information and reviews on these watches, I will have links in the description down below. The purpose of this video is looking at more of the buying decision of looking at these two watches under $1,000. If you're somebody that's looking for a value-driven chronograph under $1,000, how can you really think about the decision here? And before we jump in, we've just released some great new content on teddybaldassarre.com on our blog page. Number one, the backstory around Walter White, the famous chemistry teacher turned drug kingpin, and the watches that he wore throughout the series, including a $30 Casio up to a luxury chronograph from Tag Heuer. So if you want the full background on those watches, how that came to be, where they were featured, we'll have a link down below in the description. Also coverage of Smiths, which is a brand that I think some people know that they're familiar with Sir Edmund Hillary and his expedition of Everest. Commonly, people bring up the Rolex Explorer, but really the unspoken for hero, or those in the know that know, understand that Smiths was actually the watch in many ways that was the fixture on that expedition. If you want to learn about the full detailed story about that with Smiths and that relation to the Rolex Explorer, all that drama, we'll have a link in the description down below to both of those articles. Also, before we jump in, this is opinionated. I'm going to try my best to give reason why one brand might win out over the other with some of these different categories, but it really does, again, depend on your personal preference for many of these. I've spent a lot of time handling these watches and having experience with them on wrist, so wanted to just give some of that opinion and thought process for those that might be thinking about making a purchase here. Now, the first category is wearability. Again, this is coming down to personal preference, but what I'm looking at is more of what watch collection the Speedtimers versus the Lunar Pilot offers up more optionality, more wearability possibilities for the widest array of wrists out there. And for that, I'm going to give the win to Seiko. I think the case sizes of 39 by 45.5 for the SSC 8 series, and then the SSC 9 series comes in at 41.4 with a 45.9 millimeter length. Both of them are going to wear smaller, so I would say that the Speedtimer 8 series is going to wear closer to a 38 millimeter on wrist, and then for the SSC 9 series, probably closer to a 40 millimeter on wrist. I think that will be more favorable for more wrists out there because of just the spread of those two sizes. And with the Bulova Lunar Pilot, I think they are positioned to kind of accommodate the same general wrist size, usually larger wrist, medium to larger wrist. I think you could probably pull it off for at least the 43.5 millimeter option that has a 51 millimeter lug to lug, and then the original 45 millimeter option with a 52 millimeter lug to lug. The reality is both of them are larger watches. I think it would be great to see a Speedtimer available in a larger size for those that do like the wearability of the Lunar Pilot. But generally speaking, what one of these two watches accommodates more wrists out there, I would say the Speedtimers win in that regard. Next, we have case and dial finishing. So I think these are pretty close in terms of their execution. I will give a slight edge to Bulova, so they're going to get the point here. The case finish and the pushers on the Bulova feel a tad more elevated and premium. Also, with the Blue Panda variant specifically, that model gets an easy win for its dial. The granular texture, the applied blue indices, it's a beautiful dial to look at up close if you've never seen it. It gets lost in a lot of the product photos that you might see online. But hopefully with some of the photos here, videos here, you get a sense that, wow, that's actually a pretty nice looking dial. Speedtimer, very straightforward, certainly not bad in this category, but I would give the slight edge to Bulova. Now, versatility, I'm gonna give this one a tie. Now, not all the Speedtimers are going to be as versatile given the wide array of color variants that you have to choose from, but if you go for the more monochromatic color options, those are going to be very versatile, and I would say line up very well against the Bulova Lunar Pilot in terms of utmost versatility in that department. So a tie here, both brands get a point. For water resistance, this is an easy one. This one is going to Seiko. 100 meters versus 50 meters. Neither have a screw down crown or pushers. Would I choose to go swimming with either of them? Probably not, but it is nice to have that extra security and pretty straightforward here. 100 meters, 50 meters, Seiko wins. For our fifth category, we have movement, and this is going to be an easy win for Bulova in my opinion. Probably the biggest selling point and differentiating point between these two watches. So the Bulova caliber on the inside, the MP20, oscillates at 262,144 cycles per second, which is 8 times faster than the already blistering pace of a standard quartz oscillator at 32,768 cycles per second. And with a higher frequency quartz movement, you are getting up accuracy in the process, plus or minus 10 seconds per year. So more accurate over a year than the Seiko is being quoted over a single month. Now, still very accurate on the Seiko side, but I think this is a large disparity in terms of that accuracy, which is a cool value add. Also, 1/10 of a second timekeeping I think is pretty cool. One final mention is that you can also align the hands on these watches in case you are ever out of sync when resetting, so you have small little adjustments. By pulling the crown to the farthest position, you can push the 2 o'clock pusher to move the chronograph's central seconds for very small adjustments, while pressing the 4 o'clock pusher with the crown out, adjust the 1/10 of a second hand. Seiko also has a feature very similar to this, so that is a nice little add-on here for those that are sticklers for having the utmost alignment accuracy. And then for the Seiko, just to give it a little bit of a mention when you're talking about the movement, one thing I will give it is you are getting a solar caliber on the inside. So quartz oscillation with solar power is a beautiful combination because you're getting less of a servicing interval for that, since there's no need for a conventional battery change every few years, as is the case for many quartz watches out there. So that is a useful trait, but for me, I think the large separation in accuracy gives Bulova the win here for the movement. For strap and bracelet, I'm going to give a slight edge to Bulova. I just think the bracelet feels a bit more substantial and better finished. Now, where this might open up to some subjectivity even further is for the 43.5mm options. There is a polished center link. I know some people absolutely hate that. The previous version was more of this blasted style finish. The Lunar Pilot also has a quick release system, 20mm lugs for both sizes. Biggest drawback, I think though, of the Lunar Pilot is the lack of micro adjustment, which Seiko has 2 points of micro adjustment, small clasp as well. Doesn't have quick release, 20mm on the 39mm option for that lug width, and 21mm for the 41.4mm. Again, slight edge to Bulova, but this one is close. For optionality, this is just basically how many different options do you have available to you to purchase within the collection. Easy win for Seiko. The collection for the Speedtimer has 8 variants for the US market where I am currently positioned. I'm not gonna speak to JDM models because that opens up a big can of worms. Really wanna speak to where most markets outside of Japan are, what they're gonna have available to them. And those are standard production models to add. For Bulova, they have 5 different references across a couple different sizes. They do have that limited edition option that they had a year or so ago, but simply more color options, more case sizes to choose from for the Speedtimer. It gets the win. For the crystal category, this one is a tie. Both of them do things better than the other or have a different approach than the other. For Bulova, it's more of a flat crystal. Some people might prefer that. AR coating is better on that crystal, I would say, in comparison to the Seiko. One thing I will mention is the prominent exposed edge of that sapphire crystal does leave it more susceptible to getting bashed potentially. You do really need to bash it, so I wouldn't get overly concerned about this, but it is something to call out. For Seiko, you're getting more of a dome profile, so it is going to lean into that vintage feel more on wrist. AR coating is on the underside, not as good as Bulova's, but still a sapphire crystal, different approach. For me, both of them tie. So I was debating whether or not to put this category on here because it is a can of worms, but it's heritage. So how I am classifying this is more the watches themselves and when they look back. If you look at the brands as a total idea, then I would mention Seiko. However, for just the Bulova Lunar Pilot versus the Speedtimers, I'm going to give the edge to the Lunar Pilot. Obviously, the modern name is going to be pulling directly from David Scott's Apollo 15 watch that he wore on the moon. It was a prototype watch. His model sold at auction for $1.6 million, making it one of the coolest artifacts of the Apollo program that's ever sold. I think all of this adds to the mystique of this model family and really adds to that heritage argument. Now for Seiko, if you're talking about chronographs, they have absolutely more history involved with producing chronographs back to 1969 with some of their automatic chronographs, the legendary 6139, the Pogue. But it's hard to say that this speed timer is directly associated with all the history of that. So it kind of just depends where you're gonna draw the line here. This is a difficult one to nitpick because for Bulova, very on the nose for what it's going after, and it's a watch that was very famous and who wore it and also what it was able to achieve. Then for the speed timer, it's maybe not as directly associated with just one thing in the past like Bulova is. So this one's close, but I'm gonna give a slight edge to Bulova just because of the whole moon concept here that I think is a big draw for those that might be interested in looking in the direction of these watches. For Lume, now this is a little bit more involved. It goes to Seiko, but one thing I will mention is the larger speed timer has better lume and it grows brighter. So how I would phrase this is when at its best, Seiko does it better for the speed timer, but when it's not doing it at its best with the smaller speed timer, it strangely only has lume at 12, 3, 6, and 9, and on the hands, and is superficially aged, so it does not shine as well as the Bulova. Bulova's lume is very solid. It's applied in more quantity compared to the smaller speed timer, but the best of the bunch here is the larger speed timer. Shines a little bit brighter, longer, and still applied to a reasonable degree like that of the Bulova Lunar Pilot. So a slight edge to Seiko, but just consider those factors when dealing with this concept of lume. And finally, we have price, and this one is all over the map. It will depending on what time of year looking, what specific watch you're looking at. But let's just use the retail price as a benchmark to future-proof the video and give us a common ground on where to really draw a definitive conclusion. And if you do that, Seiko Speedtimers are going to be priced between $675 and $750, and Bulova Lunar Pilot's priced between $625 and $895 at retail. Now, I would say Bulova is consistently, when you're talking about the newer models, higher on average compared to the Speedtimers. So basically for Bulova, you're dealing with shorter peaks, but also higher peaks. And then for Seiko, more consistently positioned towards that middle tier, but does greatly depend on what model you're looking for. I would say generally, Seikos are going to be more commonly available across the entire collection at a bit more of an affordable price. But again, does greatly depend. A couple other considerations I thought were notable that don't really fall into any of these classifications and categories. The Bulova sweep is smoother with that second hand. So thanks to that higher frequency, that could be a point if you're talking about wanting to have a watch that's gonna emulate a mechanical watch. I would say it's close to those 18,000 vibration per hour movements in terms of its flow. And Seiko, on the other hand, doesn't look to the same just effortless sweep or standard like many mechanical watches. Also, Seiko has a power reserve indicator at that 6 o'clock position, which I think is a fun feature. It's hidden well, nicely integrated. Some people might like that. Bulova, you get the 1/10 of a second, and then in turn, Seiko, you're getting more of an AM/PM indicator. So really depends on what you like. I just wanted to include those. They didn't really fit in any specific category and they didn't feel like they deserved an actual point. But those are some other considerations that if those bother you or are a bigger deal, might be good to know. So when we tally up the points, Bulova comes in with a total of 6 points and Seiko comes in with 7 points. So there it is. Seiko's better all around. You always have to go for the Seiko. Now, that's not how this works. Let's also break this down. This is actually a close battle, and the reason why I wanted to cover these watches is because this is a question people ask quite a bit when looking to buy these watches, and it's really hard to navigate. How I would break these down finally beyond just the point system, and it is very close and it will depend on your use case. I think the single leading characteristic of all of these points is going to be the movement for Bulova. That and the history and connection to David Scott have that X factor that I don't think Seiko can fully mirror in this just head to head. So if those are things that you really value and find cool, it's probably going to give you the edge. The other consideration obviously is going to be the design style, which I think both of them are very good, but then further, going to be the case size. Quite frankly, I just think there's going to be more people that can pull off the speed timer when you're dealing with case size wearability. So how I would simply put it is the Bulova Lunar Pilot, certainly a leader, so is the speed timer. I would say the Lunar Pilot with those two key traits of their movement and then also the connection to David Scott add this X factor. And those are two things that I don't think Seiko can perfectly respond to. But what I think what Seiko does very well is staying steady and making sense and really leaning into what many consumers are going to care about with these watches while offering up more variety with its colorways, case sizes. So I think ultimately is, what do you think about those Bulova X factors with the high accuracy quartz movement? Also the David Scott connection, does that mean anything to you? And can you pull off the size? If all of the answers to those things are no, probably the Speedtimer. But if you do find yourself loving the idea of having high accuracy, you like the NASA David Scott connection, and you do like the wearability of that watch, pretty easy go for the Bulova. But all right, guys, that is my take looking at these two watches. I'd love to hear from some owners of these watches. What made you decide on, if you were thinking about maybe comparing these two, because I think some people probably were navigating this question before, what made you decide on one of the watches, and what has your experience been like with having the watch on wrist for some time? I'd love to see comments down below, and I know that helps other people hearing ownership stories in the comments. Also, definitely check out TeddyBaldassarre.com, full authorized dealer of 30 brands, including Seiko and Bulova. Quick and fast fulfillment, dedicated customer support, and a full factory warranty for all the products that we offer. How we're also able to fund all these productions is through selling watches. So if you are in the market for a watch, we'd love to have your business because it allows us to keep doing what we're doing here. But guys, thank you again so much for watching. Be well, and I'll see you all very soon.